When a homeless man asked Clint Eastwood for just one, he never expected the legendary actor's life-changing response. It was a mild afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day where the sun felt just warm enough to keep the cool breeze at bay. Outside a quiet cafe on Melrose Avenue, a man sat at one of the outdoor tables, wearing sunglasses that partially shielded his face. He was unmistakable Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend. Though years had softened the sharpness of his features, his aura was undeniable. Passers-by occasionally glanced his way, unsure if they should interrupt the icon's moment of solitude. Across the street, another man stood unnoticed by most. His clothes were worn and layered, each piece telling a story of days spent in the elements. His hair was disheveled, and he clutched a small cardboard sign in one hand while his other fidgeted nervously in his pocket. His name was Kevin, and today marked his third week sleeping behind the dumpster of a nearby convenience store. Kevin hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days. His stomach gnawed at him, a relentless reminder of how far he'd fallen. As he scanned the cafe for someone who looked approachable, his eyes locked on Clint Eastwood. At first, he hesitated. What could a man like that possibly care about someone like him? But hunger has a way of eroding pride. Taking a deep breath, Kevin crossed the street. Each step heavier than the last. His voice was almost inaudible as he approached the actor's table. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Clint looked up slowly, removing his sunglasses. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, Kevin wondered if he'd made a mistake. But then Clint leaned back in his chair, studying Kevin as if trying to piece together a puzzle. The seconds stretched on, and Kevin's anxiety grew. He was ready to apologize and walk away when Clint finally spoke. $1, he said, his tone neutral. Then, with a hint of a smile, he added, "Sit down. Let's talk." But Kevin had no idea what he just set into motion. Kevin hesitated. The invitation felt surreal, almost like a scene out of one of those movies he used to watch when life was simpler. "Sit down with Clint Eastwood." He scanned Clint's face for a sign that this wasn't a cruel joke, but there was no malice, just a calm curiosity that made him feel both exposed and oddly comforted. With a quiet "thank you," Kevin eased into the chair across from Clint. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the cardboard sign on the table, angling it so it wouldn't catch too much attention. He could feel the weight of Clint's gaze, but it wasn't judgmental. It was curious, like someone who wanted to know the story behind the layers of dirt and despair. Kevin wasn't used to this. Most people avoided eye contact or threw him loose change without a second thought. Nobody wanted to hear his story anymore, but sitting here under the steady gaze of someone he never imagined meeting, the words started to spill out before he could stop them. I'm sorry if I bothered you," Kevin stammered, his voice raw. "I don't usually. I mean, I don't like asking. I've been trying to find work, but it's hard. Harder than I thought it'd be." He glanced down at his hands, ashamed of how desperate he sounded. Clint didn't interrupt. He just listened, which was more than most had done in years. Kevin took a deep breath and continued, "The dam breaking. I was a contractor, had a crew. Steady work. Then the recession hit, and the jobs dried up. It didn't take long for the savings to run out. Then came the late notices. And after that..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Well, you can guess the rest." He tried to laugh, but it came out bitter and hollow. "Funny, right? I spent my whole life building other people's homes, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head." Clint's face remained calm, but his eyes softened. Kevin could feel the shame creeping in again. He tried to steer the conversation away from himself. I know you probably get asked for things all the time, he said. I don't mean to be another guy with a handout. I don't know what else to do anymore. But Clint wasn't the kind of man to brush off a story like that. He had a response Kevin never saw coming. Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His hands clasped loosely. The air between them felt heavier, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for this conversation. Kevin could feel his pulse quicken. He half expected Clint to hand him a couple of bucks and politely dismiss him as others had done before. But instead, Clint asked a question Kevin wasn't prepared for. What's your name? Kevin blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. Kevin, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded slowly, letting the name settle. Kevin, he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Then, after a pause, he said, You know, Kevin, I've played a lot of characters in my life: cowboys, soldiers, detectives. And one thing I've learned is that every one of them had a story. Good, bad, ugly. It didn't matter. What mattered was how they chose to carry it. So tell me this, Clint continued. What's the next chapter of your story? Kevin stared at Clint, unsure if he was serious. The next chapter, he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. Yeah, Clint said, leaning back. You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So what's the next chapter? Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't have an answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival didn't leave much room for long-term planning. I don't know, Kevin admitted, finally. I guess I just want to make it through the day. Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. That's not a chapter, Kevin. That's a sentence. You need a chapter. A real one. Something you can build on. Kevin felt an odd mix of frustration and curiosity. He wanted to ask Clint what he knew about struggle, but he held his tongue. There was something about the way Clint spoke, like he wasn't just throwing out cliches, but genuinely wanted Kevin to think. Clint reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Kevin's heart sank. This was the part where the $1 would come out, and Clint would send him on his way. But Clint didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. Go here, Clint said, his tone firm but not unkind. It's a shelter run by a buddy of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But it's up to you to take the first step. Kevin stared at the card, his hands trembling. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice cracking. Clint's expression softened just a fraction. Because someone did it for me once, and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't. But Kevin wasn't sure if he could believe in second chances, not after everything he'd been through. I don't know, man, Kevin said after a long silence, shaking his head. I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me. Clint's gaze didn't waver. People like you, what does that even mean? Kevin swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. You wouldn't get it? Guys like me, we're just forgotten. Clint leaned forward again, his voice quiet but firm. You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world and no one's there to help you lift it? Kevin looked up, startled. Clint's face, though calm, carried the weight of his words. I grew up dirt poor in the middle of the Depression, Clint continued. I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow's going to be any better. And let me tell you something, Kevin. It's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether you're willing to get back up, even when the odds are stacked against you. The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue but found he had nothing to say. Clint leaned back, his tone softening. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers. But what I do know is this: life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you're going to let that break you or build you. Kevin felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. It's not that simple, he said, his voice cracking. No, it's not, Clint agreed. But simple doesn't mean easy. It's hard as hell, but if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been. Kevin stared at the card again, his mind racing. He thought about the nights he'd spent on cold concrete, the meals he'd scavenged from dumpsters, the faces that turned away from him every day, and now here was this man, a stranger, a legend, telling him he was worth more than all of that. For the first time in years, Kevin felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or maybe it was just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. I'll think about it, Kevin said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded, as if that was enough. Good. That's all I'm asking. But Kevin wasn't the only one affected by this encounter. Clint had his own reasons for stepping in, reasons that would soon come to light. Kevin clutched the business card tightly as he stood to leave, unsure of what to say or how to feel. Clint's words echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he'd buried long ago of better days, of dreams that once felt achievable. As he took a few hesitant steps away, he turned back. Thanks for listening, he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the street. Clint gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Take care of yourself, Kevin, he said simply, before slipping his sunglasses back on and returning to his coffee. But Kevin didn't see Clint's hand falter slightly as he picked up the cup. He didn't notice the way Clint's jaw tightened for a brief moment, as if holding back a flood of emotion. Sitting alone again, Clint let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair where Kevin had been just moments before. It wasn't the first time he'd been reminded of his past, but it hit harder this time. He'd been younger than Kevin when he'd first learned how quickly life could knock you down. Growing up during the Great Depression, Clint had watched his parents struggle to keep food on the table. There were nights when all they had was a can of beans to share between them. And then there were the strangers, neighbors, church folk, sometimes complete nobodies who had stepped in with small acts of kindness that made all the difference. He remembered one man in particular, a mechanic who'd offered Clint his first job a chance to earn a few bucks cleaning tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something invaluable, the dignity of work, no matter how small. That man had seen potential in a scrawny kid that no one else did, and it had changed the course of Clint's life. Now, decades later, Clint carried that lesson with him. He'd built a career that most people could only dream of, but he'd never forgotten where he came from or the people who helped him get there. For Clint, helping Kevin wasn't about charity. It was about giving someone else the chance he'd once been given. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Kevin, but he also knew that sometimes all it took was one person believing in you to spark something bigger. Meanwhile, Kevin walked aimlessly through the streets, the card still clenched in his hand. He passed by shop windows where his reflection stared back at him, tired, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something new. He stopped outside a laundromat, staring at the flickering neon sign. With the little money he had left, he decided to wash his clothes. If he was going to show up at that shelter Clint had mentioned, he wanted to look presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a step. That first step would be the hardest and the most important one Kevin had taken in years. Kevin's first visit to the shelter was overwhelming. The fluorescent lights, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the steady buzz of voices made him feel out of place. But the staff was kind. They didn't judge him for the state he was in. And for the first time in years, Kevin felt like someone actually saw him not as a problem, but as a person. Days turned into weeks, and though the road wasn't smooth, Kevin began piecing his life back together. The shelter helped him secure a temporary job at a nearby warehouse, where he quickly proved himself to be reliable and hard-working. With the money he earned, he moved into a modest shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head and a step toward stability. Through it all, he thought about Clint Eastwood. He'd kept the business card now worn and creased as a reminder of the moment that changed everything. One night, after a particularly long shift, Kevin sat down and wrote Clint a letter. He thanked him for the kindness he'd shown that day at the cafe and told him about the progress he'd made. Kevin didn't expect a response, but writing the letter felt like closure, a way to acknowledge the man who had given him a second chance. Months later, Clint received the letter, sitting in his quiet office. He read it carefully, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer where he kept other mementos from his life. For Clint, it was never about recognition or gratitude. It was about paying forward the compassion he'd been shown when he needed it most. Kevin's story didn't end there. Inspired by his own journey, he started volunteering at the same shelter that had helped him. He spoke with others who were struggling, sharing his story and offering them the same encouragement Clint had given him. Slowly but surely, he became a symbol of resilience and hope within his community. The cafe on Melrose Avenue remained a quiet backdrop for countless passers-by, unaware of the life-changing conversation that had taken place there. But for Kevin and Clint, it would always be more than just a meeting. It was a moment that proved the power of human connection, a simple gesture that rippled outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. And for those who hear their story, it serves as a reminder, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the greatest transformations.